right, everybody, welcome. Good morning. Today is Numbers Day. It is every labor economist's favorite day, I tell my students. Welcome to the Workers by the Numbers blogcast, presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Alicia Modestino. I am professor at Northeastern University in the economics department and the School of Public Policy, and also the executive director of something called Community to Community, which is a new initiative aimed to promote the use of community engaged research to make social change. This morning, we get to talk about the latest job numbers, job creation, unemployment, wages, all the good stuff, everything that is hot off the presses just 15 minutes ago from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And joining me today to analyze the numbers is our expert panel with lots of experience from various corners of the labor economist field. Today, we have actually an all-female panel of economists. Why is this such a big deal? Well, if you've been paying attention, only about a quarter of economists are women. And let's just say that if you Google economics and diversity, it's a pretty bleak picture. So I'm really delighted today to be joined by two fabulous female economists. First, Dr. Elise Gould, senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you.
And second, Dr. Teresa Ghilarducci of the New School, who is a professor of economics and the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy and Analysis. Welcome, Teresa.
Hey, thank you. Really good to be with all of you women.
All right, well, let's do the numbers. I'm a big Kai Ryssdal fan, so I always wanted to say that. Here are the headline numbers from BLS's August Employment Situation Report, which just landed 15 minutes ago. The unemployment rate rose to 3.8% in August. Last month, it was 3.5%. And it's kind of been in this range of 3.4 to 3.7% since March, when the Fed first started raising interest rates. Although we had a little discussion amongst ourselves, we're not too concerned about this tick up in the unemployment rate because the labor force participation rate rose by 0.2 percentage points to 62.8% after being flat since March. That's reflecting a lot of new entrants coming into the labor market. So that's a good thing. So when we see unemployment rate rise because more people want to be in the labor market, that actually signals that good things are happening. So we're not going to worry too much about the tick up in the unemployment rate. The economy created 187,000 jobs in August. That's actually technically flat from July's increase that was reported, although that number from July was revised downwards. So this would be a slight increase. It's in line with what economists were expecting, actually a little bit better than what economists were expecting. That number was around 177,000 jobs. And really, this is what we would expect to see coming off of the crazy fast job creation rate that we had over the last several years. It's 400,000 per month in 2022, which was pretty much off the charts. That job creation pace has been around 330,000 jobs per month on average in 2023. So we're seeing this cooling off of the labor market as we would expect. Average hourly earnings increased by 8 cents from July to August. What do we really look at to try to contextualize that? Really what we're seeing is about a 4.3% annualized rate over the last 12 months. However, we have been seeing that wage growth accelerating over the last several months. So the first 3 months of the year, that was an annualized rate of about 3.4%. In the second quarter of the year, we saw that increasing to an annualized rate of about 4.9%. And then some quick math that we do here on the Power at Work blogcast suggests that we have seen a little bit of an uptick in that as well, possibly to about a 6% or so annualized rate over the last 2 months. Now, remember, though, of course, we have to compare that to inflation to think about what does that mean for workers. And in August, the CPI did increase on a 3.3% annualized rate. That's a slight acceleration. But again, just remember that workers are not walking home with all of this wage increase in their pocket in terms of purchasing power. And certainly that's something that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell is probably going to be looking at, especially since a lot of his comments coming out of the Jackson Hole meeting last week seemed pretty hawkish, I think, to a lot of the industry. All right, so there you have it there. That's the basic lay of the land for the numbers. A few other things to note is that if we look at the industries where jobs were created, We see strong growth in healthcare, leisure and hospitality, social assistance, construction. One of the places where we did see employment fall was transportation and warehousing, but we know that's pretty much due to the layoffs that we saw at Yellow Trucking. That's down about 30,000. But in general, I think we're seeing a jobs report that's pretty much in line with what we would expect with, a cooling labor market, a possibly soft landing. And I'm going to turn it over to my panel now to weigh in on whether or not are these numbers good for workers, bad for workers, or a mixed bag. What do we think, Elise?
So I think as usual, it's mixed. For the most part, I would say that it's a pretty solid report. A lot of good news in this report. I'm going to reiterate a couple of things that you mentioned just to hit some of those points home. The unemployment rate, again, we're seeing a rise there. I think that's probably going to get a lot of attention, going from 3.5 to 3.8%. But I think it's important to remember that the employment to population ratio was flat. So the share of the working population that has a job did not change, although employment did tick up. And it ticked up in both surveys. So that's always nice to see. And so why did unemployment rate fall? That's because participation rose. So more people are coming back to the labor market, hopeful, optimistic that they're getting jobs. There may be an uptick. It's hard to see yet in the data. There's been an uptick recently in immigration. And so that is adding to the labor force as well. We'll have to look at those numbers more closely to see exactly where and what age groups people are coming back in. But it's certainly a positive sign that more people are coming back in. So I'm less concerned about that uptick in unemployment. We look at that by gender. Women certainly had a tick up in employment and participation. If we look at the prime age participation or the share of the workforce that has a job in the 25 to 54-year-old age group, which I think gets rid of some of the demographic factors that I think are important to take note. That did not change over the month, so that remained flat, just like the overall did. Men did tick down a bit in that age group, and women remained flat. But we have seen a lot of movement in women's employment. They've been the group that has surpassed their pre-pandemic levels to a greater degree than men have. We saw for
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to give a couple more numbers. I think Black unemployment, I think, is a very important indicator to be watching here. Oftentimes we think about historically marginalized groups, what's happening with them. They're the first ones that are going to feel the recession. So Black unemployment, youth unemployment, some of those groups are ones that we tend to look at to see the canary in the coal mine. And there we actually saw Black unemployment back down to 5.3%. That's certainly a promising sign, particularly because their employment rate also rose, although their participation softened. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Excellent. I was just going to jump in there because it'll be really interesting to see what happens to female participation next month as we get the September jobs report, because we know from emerging research that really came out of the pandemic that every time we hit the next school year, there's often a dip in female participation and employment. And it'll be interesting to see if women kind of persist with that strong performance as we move into the school year.
100%.
Teresa, I'm going to turn to you. What do you think? Good, bad, mixed bag for workers? What's your sense?
Well, the safe answer is mixed, but I really want to talk about the good news. The good news is the unemployment rate is still really low. And so that most people that are looking for jobs will probably get one. So that's always good. We really can't forget the times when we were used to 6% unemployment, 9% unemployment. And so for the last few years, for it to be under 4 is actually, amazing for an economist. These are really, really low numbers. But the good news kind of stops there. I really look at the job fear number, the worker confidence number, the take that job and shove it number. When workers are quitting, when they're leaving a job and they don't have another job lined up, that shows a lot of moxie and and it actually is an indicator that you might be able to get a wage increase, before you leave. It shows some confidence that when you get a new job, you can get a big increase. But those numbers, those moxie or power numbers, are falling. On Tuesday, with the other labor report, the JOLTS numbers, we saw that the quits rate is falling. It's actually at a lower level than it's been in years. And in today's report, just what now, 25 minutes ago, we see that the percentage of people who are unemployed, who are job leavers, has actually fallen. Last month, it was over 14% of the people who were unemployed because they had left their jobs, but now it's only a little above 12%. That's a big drop. I also look at what's happening to men and women, but I'm really interested in the age group over 55. I'm interested in them because the pension system has really failed that group over the last 40 years. Our private pension system has failed most workers, and Social Security has been gradually cut since 1983. So increasingly, people over 55 are having to work in order to maintain their living standards or even avoid poverty. And what I found is that the labor force participation for women who are over 55 has increased, but for men, it's gone down. And so I'm expecting, just higher levels of poverty, among our elderly. So I looked closely at that group. I also looked at sectors, and this is, we see a big increase in unemployment in the financial sector and in the information technology sector. And that makes sense for all of us who are looking at headlines about layoffs in tech. And we're seeing employers really change strategy in that sector, and it may actually show up in other sectors. So instead of talking about quiet quitting, which was last year's kind of Google search term, where people were slowing down on the job, even though they weren't quitting, they were actually just quitting, at their desk. And that was a great fear among employers about whether or not productivity was going to go down and costs, were going to go up because workers weren't working harder. Well, that kind of faded as an issue, for about 4 months. And now we see employer strategy being under the microscope, that perhaps they're not only are they just laying off workers just directly in this kind of headline layoff moves, but they're also changing the jobs that workers have by changing their job titles or intensifying the work, demanding more of them, demanding that they come into work, demanding that they work harder. And that's called kind of quiet cutting. So we are seeing employers having more moxie and probably more power in terms of how they're treating workers. And then last, Alicia, and I'll stop. We are seeing wage increases, as was reported today, but if you divide it by inflation, and those numbers come out in 2 weeks with a real earnings report, is we are seeing most workers lose ground. Real earnings are falling. The only place where we've gotten stability in wages are in leisure and hospitality. That may be because the Starbucks workers are organizing, but it's also because minimum wage laws have boosted wages at the very bottom. So we still have, overall, you asked me, what do I see? I see weakness for workers. The stock market's happy, and the Federal Reserve, is saying, well, maybe the economy, I can slow down a little bit. I don't know if they're hawkish out of Jackson Hole. We can talk about that. But the markets, the financial markets are thinking that they're going to stop raising interest rates for a while. So I guess owners of capital are quite happy, but it's on the backs of workers.
Yeah, not to make it unanimous, but it does seem it's hard to wave your flag and feel like this is a rah kind of jobs report for workers. At the same time, you can't really say that it's a bad report. So I'm going to go with mixed bag with you all. And I think you raised a really important point around the quiet cutting. And I'm definitely hearing, particularly in the financial industry, exactly what you're talking about, where even, promotions have been retrenched on, lots of shifting of the deck chairs to see who will actually get a seat before the music stops. And I think we're seeing a lot of this because employers are still reluctant to cut because they spent a lot of time looking for these workers and filling jobs. And, there's a point at where it was very difficult to hire. So they are, kind of putting up a few hoops or some litmus test about, which are the workers that they want to keep. And it's definitely an interesting time, though, where you do feel that balance potentially shifting, where workers are being asked to do more, they're not being given as much flexibility, those kinds of things. So yeah, I will go with mixed bag. I do still think we're coming out on the winning side, as you said, on wages at the lower end, which I think is incredibly important. And some of that has been, not just Starbucks and organizing, but I think also those were the hardest jobs to fill coming out of the pandemic. And there was a recognition that those jobs had really lagged behind in terms of not just pay, but quality, scheduling, all of those kinds of things. Okay, so let's think a little bit about what your below the headline insight is here. What did you look at this report and say, oh, aha, this is interesting to me, or, what's kind of your favorite bellwether that you want to tell us about today? Elise, I'll jump back to you. What did you see in today's report that caught your eye?
So I think I talked about some of the top line numbers that I think are important to watch. The Black unemployment rate is absolutely a key one, as opposed to, and in addition, I think other measures are important to keep track of. I think one thing that is not getting enough attention is public sector employment. Government employment is still down 213,000 since the pandemic. If you look at state and local employment, it's down 1.5%. If you look at today's report, local government education is down over 10,000. So again, something that we'll have to look at next month in terms of what is going on there as kids return to school. As you said, we look at women's employment as well when kids return to school. I think looking at these numbers, wondering about all the articles about vacancies in for teachers and among other school staff, and we'll have to see what is going on there. So that's certainly one thing I'm looking at. I think the wage growth numbers are actually continue to be promising, right? We're looking ahead to what the Federal Reserve is going to do. And I think that, this is not an overheating economy. Wage growth continues to fall, particularly I'm seeing that over the 3 months. And when we think about decelerating wage growth, it's important to keep in mind it's not, we're thinking about how are workers doing. That's a little bit different from when we think about nominal wage growth, because inflation has been falling faster. So inflation has been falling very sharply. And so this deceleration is much slower than what is happening with inflation. And so we're going to see, we have seen over the last 3 months, real wage growth, average real wage growth for private sector workers has risen. And I expect that to happen when we get that new data out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that'll definitely be the proof in the pudding there to see what's actually happened over a longer period of time, and that official matchup, right, of inflation versus wage growth to see where we're at. That'll probably be a really important number, I would think, for the Fed to really understand kind of where workers are, and whether or not they've kind of created this magical scenario where they've been able to tame inflation without undercutting workers at the same time. Teresa, what did you see that caught your eye?
Yeah, I was very happy about the increase in new entrants. That the unemployed, the numbers are coming from people joining the labor market for the first time, and that's a really good sign. That means there's a little bit of optimism that you can get jobs. It may be an added worker effect that people who were on the sidelines are actually going to work because their family needs more money. So we have to look at that. I think that we can highlight here and maybe talk to the Fed, as we're telegraphing, on YouTube, that their old model that somehow workers are the source of inflation really has to be abandoned. There's been no evidence of that here, probably not even in the leisure and hospitality sector. If you think your Starbucks coffee price has gone up because workers have massively gotten wage increases, that just isn't showing up.
Right.
Even they've just been staying even, so they're not pushing up prices. And it looks like from the productivity numbers, especially with this quiet cutting, that if workers are getting a wage increase, they're paying for it out of their hide. I've been looking at, Alicia, and I'm going to look at it for the next month, these job injury numbers. They come from different places, but there was a recent survey of attorneys, and people who are personal injury attorneys, who are the ones that will take up issues of long-term illnesses that you don't always see in the labor department. And those have gone way up. In the occupation I'm obsessed with is home health care and personal care workers. Not only are we adding, 1.4 million jobs in that sector, which, to put it in perspective, we're expecting 10 million jobs, or a little over 10 million jobs to be created in the next 10 years. Over 10% of that, 14% of that is happening in that one sector. The back injuries and the pay in that sector. So I think workers, are paying for their wage increases that they're getting through increased work and maybe increased injury. But again, going back to the question that you answered, I'm very happy to see, with a low unemployment rate, we're still seeing people participating.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and something, we'll think about drilling down maybe when we see the jobs report next month, in the intervening weeks, is really like, who's coming back into the labor market, right? Who are those new entrants? Are they, younger workers who are coming in? Are they older workers who maybe retired a little too early after the pandemic, for the reasons that you suggested, where, the pension system's not that robust, and we are still seeing inflation. So or is it, due to immigration? Like, it'll be really interesting to see what's happening there over
Are we
time.
not interested? Remember, we were interested in mothers. We were all
mothers,
obsessed about
right,
mothers,
right.
but I
Mothers
really would like,
persist.
it may not be that interesting anymore. I think they've recovered and they really weren't out anyway, but let's look at that as well. But that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for me, I'm always looking at the youth labor numbers, particularly in the summer. I was a little concerned last month in July, just to give a quick recap. We had seen that youth unemployment had ticked down, but it was largely for white youth. For Black youth, it was going in the opposite direction, as they were potentially still searching for that summer job to nail it down. I'm glad to see in today's report that actually we're seeing the reverse of that, right? So we're seeing that the unemployment rate for Black youth 16 to 19 fell from 20.7% in July to 16.9% in August. So it looks like young people were able to find something productive to do with their time and earn a wage doing it. For white youth, it ticked up slightly, from 9.5% to 10.9%, which then, if you look at that gap, it did narrow over the month of August, but we're still in a world where the Black youth unemployment rate is, 6 percentage points higher than the white youth unemployment rate. So rising tide, lifting all boats, but not lifting them all equally. And that's, where I think some of these summer youth employment programs come in and are very helpful in filling that gap. I know in looking at the numbers in Boston, they employed a record number of 7,000 youth across the city. That was an increase coming out of the pandemic, whereas last year they had only employed about 5,000. And so there's really a push to make sure that these opportunities are there and that they're open to all youth, regardless of which neighborhood they're living in, what is their household, and by race as well. So it was good to see those numbers coming out in August. And again, those are opportunities where young people get to build skills. Some get to continue into the school year working part-time, but all in all, like, it's nice to see that gap going in the direction that we would hope for. All right, so last question, panel. What does this all mean for worker power, right? We just talked a little bit about how this is a mixed bag for workers, this jobs report. We know there's a cooling labor market. Taking that longer term view of, what are workers going to be able to negotiate or get out of this labor market? I'd love to know, Elise, what do you think? What does this mean for worker power in the next, 3, 6, 9, 12 months?
Well, I think right now we're in a pretty good position. I think that, even though we saw pretty large revisions, I think there might be a big deal made about the large revisions over the last couple of months, so that 2 months ago, that number looks a little bit low over the last year. But I think that remembering that all of the numbers we've seen over the last few years and even over the last 3 months are far in excess of population growth. So the economy is still growing. It is absorbing the population and more. And so that is certainly a positive sign for workers. I think that we also have to remember that what is happening right now, the faster wage growth that has happened for lower wage workers, that is moderating some. And if we do come into a recession, if the Federal Reserve keeps raising rates, that soft landing, even if it's, we have a mild recession, that is going to be very bad for certain groups of workers. And we've done very little to lock in the gains that we've had. We haven't made changes to the unemployment insurance system like we did during the pandemic. There is very little will, it seems, by federal policymakers to create a safety net if we hit a recession. And so there's a huge danger on that front. So that's certainly something I want to be looking out for.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, even some of the things that we did during the pandemic, we've retrenched on, right? We've allowed them to expire, or we've, deliberately cut them. I mean, right now, I think we're kind of living off a little bit. The stimulus is still working its way through city and state budgets and different types of programs that are out there. But, there's definitely a cliff coming when that federal stimulus is going to be running out. And if that's intersecting with a cooling labor market, that could really be a problem, in the future for workers. What do you see on the horizon, Teresa, for worker power?
Alicia and Elise, of course, we know that the market can only do so much for labor power. Institutions matter as well. So overall, we have to look at unionization numbers. We have to look at whether or not unions, if they organize, they actually get a collective bargaining contract. And we also care about institutions like childcare sector. Women will not be able to be powerful at work, unless and men too, but mostly the unpaid care work falls on women, on mothers, without having a social wage, a social institution. So we have to look at institutions. But in terms of the market, again, overall, it's really great that a market can absorb new entrants, that the unemployment rate is low, and that if anybody enters or quits or is fired, they probably can get another job. That's overall good. But over the last year, labor power in terms of worker confidence and moxie has actually gone down. The quit rate has fallen, the job leaver rate has fallen, and wages have not been able to keep up with inflation. We're getting a lot of that aggregate demand from the stimulus, not from wage push demand. So overall, I celebrate a very low unemployment rate, and all policies, whether it be fiscal or monetary policy, should be aimed at keeping that unemployment rate low.
Yeah, and I think, I want to pick up on something that you said in terms of organizing, right? So we have seen more organizing among labor, among workers. I mean, even the long-standing now Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild strikes that have been going on since early May, when we, sort of entered that potential summer blockbuster season of Barbenheimer, right? All of that is still playing out. But, it's been interesting, they're not just asking for wages, but they're also asking, for residuals, for streaming content. They're asking for protections regarding the use of AI and, in creative endeavors and things like that. So it's definitely a very interesting time, all the way from, the creative knowledge-based sector, all the way down to the entry-level jobs that we think about in terms of organizing and worker power, where there's a lot of shifts and dynamics that are happening, even with technology adoption. I think that, one of the reasons why we're not seeing wage growth really fuel inflation growth at this point is that, corporations are still sitting on a ton of cash, right? Corporate profits are still up coming out of the pandemic. Like, they can afford to raise wages still. And, I think we're not quite there yet where they're actually feeling the pinch of these wage increases, which means they can go further. But the question is, will they go further? And I do, worry a little bit with, 2 job reports in a row where we're seeing sort of a cooling off, which is nice because it's sane and, we have more of a hope for a soft landing. But at the same time, we do start to see that subtle shift, right, from a buyer's market, from a seller's market to a buyer's market in terms of labor. And we do wonder what that's going to mean with the quiet cutting that you mentioned earlier. So I think it's something for us to definitely keep an eye on. And yeah, childcare was the one thing that was left on the cutting room floor when it came to the Democratic agenda, right, coming out of the pandemic. That was the one thing we got no movement on, really, in terms of meeting families where they are to be able to afford care, while also paying a living wage to the caregivers as well, right? And you cannot square that circle without public investment, and we're not there yet. So, all right, I'm gonna bring the conversation to a close right there. I want to thank today's guests, Elise Gould from EPI. It was lovely to see you again. And Teresa Ghilarducci, it was wonderful to meet you from the new school. I have a new connection now. This is excellent. I also want to thank Asia Sims, our producer, for getting us together and doing all the technological wizardry that goes into this. And before you go, I would be remiss if I did not ask you to subscribe to the Power at Work blog. I would probably also get an email from Seth Harris reminding me to ask you to do that. But that's where you can really keep updated on all the great content that's coming out, including not just this Numbers Day podcast, but many other podcasts related to worker power. And thanks for watching. And we look forward to seeing you again in 4 weeks on Numbers Day.